got older and left Chicago, would come back intermittently, that I grew to appreciate Carlos more and more, and his love and support of the younger artists, how he always supported us. He came out to the events. He saw himself as a poet and an artist. And he just was, he was so kind to us and generous in a way that maybe you don't realize when you're young. And we saw him mosque as an elder and respected him and looked up to him. And it's only now that I appreciate Carlos more than I did when he was alive. Qué triste, ¿verdad? But he taught me so much without realizing he was teaching me.
Es el jefe. Ese es el patriarca de los artistas acá. Porque pasaron todas las etapas y él las vivió. Y su presencia está todavía en esta solidaridad entre artistas. Yo creo que él fue el ejemplo, lo hizo con el ejemplo. No andaba, yo soy el Luyuyuy, el Juan Camané, ni nada de eso. Solamente en la acción, él representa eso para los artistas. Yo no sé para quién más, pero los artistas.
And then when he would see, I feel that to me he was a silent, loud expression, because he would just observe in our actions when we would meet in our group meetings. He was silent and very observing of who was there and how we joined or participated in the gatherings. And I felt that was something that I enjoyed of him, his quietness, and not judging, just observing. And then when he seen that there was something that he was sharing, that I could see his expression that he was acknowledging us.
With Carlos, he was always, the way that I always saw him was like a father or a grandfather that I never had, that was a role model for the arts, as far as his ideas, as far as his ideology, as far as his principles, as far as his morals. I think all of those aspects were exemplary for all of us and in a collective, and for me specifically, committed completely to his art and to his ideas and to disseminating them, and how he utilized printmaking as a vehicle to bring about issues to the forefront, to comment, to criticize.
I just always remember him with a lot of kindness, and I remember that he was trying to live his life in a very peaceful way. And I think it's sometimes hard to imagine, because he was also a fighter, and he was somebody who would put these messages in your face, whether it was about police brutality or around anti-Blackness, or around standing up to the bosses. But he was also just a soft, caring, generous man who really modeled for me how it is that, male artists could work with the next generation of artists, especially women artists like myself. So I always remember Carlos really fondly because of that.
His long table, that's where it's not that he held court, it was by design. That was for any guest, anytime, to come in, sit down. Carlos is there as he was listening to the person sharing, I got an issue, I got a problem, or I got a project, I got, whatever the conversation was. I got to buy a goat, whatever the conversation was. He would just be listening. And then Carlos would, a man of many words through his art mediums, but not so much when he was listening. He would say a few things. Mostly his quips were like a question to help that person heal or move into some other space so that they could take it from there. But that table was like, oh my God, it was just an amazing table. It's wood and just like him, natural.
Sometimes to visit Cortez was to spend an evening just listening to an album. And I know that seems impossible to people today, but people who really know good sounds would be prone to listening to vinyl and playing that. And he would say, we're going to have and he'd sit there and have a cigarette, drink his whiskey, and maybe I'd sip up, whatever. And we would just listen to music, and that was an evening. So again, Cortez mentored me and the world of broadening my appreciation for classical and for world music. But he also listened to music that was, I guess, it would be categorized as indigenous tribal music. And so he had a collection of that as well.
Años y Mexicanos.
Indian pride is Mexican pride.
Indian pride is Mexican pride.
That was on his refrigerator.
Yeah, that was on his refrigerator.
I remember that, yeah.
We had it on the altar too, because it's just fundamental. Yeah. Also, you know, part of that culture and root, you know, he did honor the Nahuatl in his work, the Spanish and the English, right? All of it together.
Except when I finally did meet him, he had this bigote. He looked kind of like this, with a big bushy bigote and like a Mexican ranchero hat. But he didn't sound Mexican. He had this very Anglo accent and this little kind of Mexican ranchero body, very skinny, like a beef jerky. And he did have an accent, but I couldn't place it. A kind of sing-songy way of talking, but it wasn't a Mexican way. And I was also enamored of his lifestyle, of his way of, you know, being. He would like give you pieces of art. When most artists are trying to become famous, he was more intent on the art reaching the people, because he was, like my boyfriend, wobbly, a member of the workers of the world, the anarchists.
Loved like his political acumen, like how sharp he was around the political reality of people in Chicago and workers specifically. You know, he was with the, he was a wobbly. Carlos was a wobbly, and what he brought to his art was a very strong analysis of history and also how it is that workers have organized for their rights. And a particular poster I remember in particular that I love is the poster of Lucy Parsons. And the poster said something about how Lucy was more dangerous than 100 men. And the way in which he depicted powerful Lucy Parsons, who could, you know, out-organize the bosses and really bring change forward, is just something that's forever etched in my memory about Carlos.
In the process, I find out Carlos was actually an active member of an organization that produces that paper, the IWW paper, called the Industrial Workers of the World. I never heard of them before. Yeah, we're the oldest union. In fact, we were founded in Chicago in 1905. Wow, okay. So now I'm learning this guy is part of a bigger group. And I didn't really become a very active member, but yeah. And then so we established that we shared the union connection. And he was going to make sure that now I was going to read the paper and I was going to learn a lot more about his points of view about working class stuff. Now that was Carlos Cortez, el hijo de Alfredo Cortez, who also was a wobbly. So Carlos came by his pro-worker stances in a very natural, encouraging home environment. His mother was a member of the American Socialist Party up in Milwaukee, where he was born. And he was raised in a household that was very receptive to things like workers' rights and unions and things of that nature.
He has, you know, his prints, his works that he was creating for the newspaper of the IWW. So there's stuff that goes back to the 50s. Learning that he was writing reviews on films, on records, on writing articles on different subjects. I mean, in so many ways, he was a Renaissance man. And then his own poetry as well. So very well-cultured individual that had a very particular vision of the world.
a dar más apoyo a los mexicanos que llegaban y a los y el movimiento que adopta el barrio, el movimiento chicano. Total. Pero sí, Carlos, él participó en todas esas etapas. Y su casa, pues como te digo, era como una pequeña galería de la obra, representando la obra de los demás. Y también su obra, pero sí era espacio abierto con muchos espacios para sentarse, diferentes mesas. Y la cocinita estaba detrás, los cuartos más atrás. Pero era un lugar yo no he visto otro lugar en el barrio como ese, porque tú llegabas y cualquier sitio que fueras, que te movieras, ahí estaba la obra o pequeños objetos que representaban algo de lo que era el movimiento. Y la prensa la tenía en el basement.
I feel as a movement that we all are part of a cultural identity as Mexicans, being born, raised here, not Mexicans coming here, since we identify with. He did his skill in printmaking, or painting, but it reflected the images or the symbols that he was using. And I felt, oh, okay. That was him. But he didn't impose as this is the way. No, I felt that we all have our way. I feel that that's a respect I have on that he let, because there were many of us that were part of this group as a Chicano artist identity, and he was part of that.
A revealing thing for me was after meeting Jose Montoya and Malaquias Montoya and learning about so many other Chicano artists, realizing that they did their work more like in the 60s, and then here in Chicago, learning with Carlos that he had actually started a whole decade before. So at one point in time, Jose Montoya mentioned that Carlos Cortez was a Chicano before anybody else was calling themselves a Chicano artist.
Carlos's legacy is how we as artists should stand in solidarity with worker movements. Because as artists, we are also workers. And in fact, in this country, many artists face the same wage conditions that workers face. And Carlos always made it very clear that workers needed to unite, right? He brought forth a very radical and revolutionary and needed worker analysis. And if we think about that today, at a time when corporations have so much power and workers are organizing in a way we haven't seen before because of economic crisis, because of wealth inequality and wealth consolidation, I feel very proud to have learned from Carlos that as artists, we must stand in solidarity with workers and with unions and with people who are fighting for better working conditions. And that's something that I continue to do today. And it's something that Carlos taught me, not just through theory, but through actual practice.
Mariana, beautiful Mariana. Aries Mariana, born in April. Springtime person, practically. Mariana was younger, maybe 13 years younger than Carlos. And their romance should be turned into a movie, because he was introduced to her while visiting Milwaukee. She came in with her brother Nico, and he was friends of Carlos, and he lived in Milwaukee. And Mariana came from Greece to visit her brother, and then came into the store where Carlos worked selling albums. And they took a liking to each other. And Carlos asked if he could write to her. And she said, sure. But he explained to her that I'm going to have to, I don't speak Greek. And she said, I don't read English. And he said, do you read Spanish? And she says, no, but I read Italian. So he said, I'm going to write to you in Italian. So he would write to her in Italian, and she would write back in Italian, and Greek sometimes. And that went on for about 8.5 years, back and forth, back and forth. So finally, Carlos's wish was to come to Greece and ask her parents for her hand. She said, do it, let's do it. You ready? Yeah, I'll bring you to the States, let's go. And he came. So he took the boat to Greece. And he goes and sees her parents, and they granted him to marry her. That's the custom for her. And so they came back to the States and eventually lived in Milwaukee, in Carlos's parents' home, who they were no longer there. And so he had the home. They lived there for a while. And finally, Carlos decided, let's get more active in cultural stuff. And Chicago has a greater cultural scene. So he sold the house. And they moved to Chicago in 1965. I don't know what month, but 1965.
He was kind of like a títere, you know, if I had to describe him, very lean and long, like a marionette. And then he had his wife, who was like a rag doll. She was like a little muñequita, this Greek woman named Mariana. And she was robust and he was lean. And the two of them were a model for me of like something I'd never seen, two artists in love, very supportive of each other. She worked laundering at the rectory at the Paul Church, if I remember right. And it seemed to me this fantastic union of, you know, Mariana, who spoke like Greek women speak, like that was her first language, kind of like a seagull. And she'd go, Carlos, you know, like a seagull. And Carlos, who was very sprightly and had some accent that I couldn't place. And later, as I got to know them, they invited us, Carlos Compián, me, Raul Niño, Beatriz Badikian, all the emergency taco poets to their house for a New Year's Eve party. And more than anything, he and Mariana were guiding us and teaching us of how to be as artists in our community, how to serve. And it wasn't about a hedonistic lifestyle at all. It was about simplicity and humility and service. And I mean, I didn't get it at the time. It was just all so new to me. But now in retrospect, I think that
every New Year's Eve, Carlos, in his maximum humanitarian trickster way, right? Coyote song. He would host the annual gathering, the annual event for very inclusive, a variety of people, but mostly folks in the struggle. Artistas, all mediums, right? Everybody who met him, academics, obreros, you know, friends, foes, tú sabes. It was like the event to go if you were, you know, in la calle, you know, la plebe, you know, la gente.
The New Year's Eve gathering, that whole place was packed. Mm-hmm. You could hardly move with folks. And one thing is for certain is that you would leave there, folks who didn't know each other would leave there as friends. And it didn't matter if you were an academic, and also talk about the diversity of artists. There were poets, there were photographers, there were painters, there were you know, all sorts of folks that were there. There were dancers, and it was beautiful, really, that if we think about the holidays.
I was a young woman when I met him. I was just starting out in my creative career. And in many situations in the past, I had dealt with male artists taking up a lot of space. But that was not the case with Carlos. Carlos was always very generous with his time and very kind and funny and just excited to work with younger artists like myself, very open and very willing to share what he knew. And the first time I met him, I told him what a big fan I was of his work because I had been studying his work at the Center for Political Graphics. And I got to drive him around LA. I got to meet him and his wife. And then when I went to go visit in Chicago, when he was still alive, I got to see his studio. I got to see how he worked. And he showed me many, many things.
So one time I was helping him print on his Van de Gogh press that he had in the basement in his house, and he was inking it and printing it. To begin with, there was very little light, so it's hard to see exactly what you were doing. And then he was just printing the quantities, and then I was looking at the prints. I said, well, can we add a little more ink, make sure that you fill in the spaces, there is too much open space, uneven, or you added too much ink here. No, he says, no, the thing is to reproduce it and make the images, don't worry about that. So that was not a concern for him. Graphically, they were always very, very strong, very, very powerful pieces with the balance, with the main focus of the composition, the main message, and the words that he utilized.